Imagine it's a crisp spring morning in 1837, and you're living in New York City. Just yesterday, you felt wealthier land deeds looked promising. Your banknotes seemed as good as gold, and business bustled in the streets. But overnight, the mood shifts. Banks refuse withdrawals, merchants shutter their shops, and whispers of failure sweep through the crowded markets. You walk past men in fine coats, clutching worthless paper bills, staring at the ground as if the city itself had betrayed them. The dream of prosperity has collapsed like a row of dominoes, one falling into the next, until nothing is left standing. This was not just a bad date, it was the birth of a national disaster. The Panic of 1837 swept across America like a storm, toppling banks, ruining fortunes, and plunging the young nation into years of depression. It was a crisis born of speculation, reckless policies, and an unshakable belief that prosperity could only rise higher. Instead, the fall was brutal. In this story, we'll travel back to the exuberant boom of the 1830s, meet the fiery president, who declared war on the nation's bank, and witness how ordinary Americans, farmers, workers, and merchants were swept up in a frenzy of speculation that ended in ruin. Along the way, you'll notice unsettling echoes of later disasters. From the Great Depression of 1929 to the mortgage meltdown of 2008, history has a way of reminding us, bubbles always burst. So settle in, keep your eyes open, and let's step into an America that thought it was invincible right before the ground vanished beneath its feet. And hey, before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any of the wild, sleepless journeys through history that we've got coming. America in the 1830s carried itself like a young man, flushed with confidence, strung, energetic, and perhaps just a little reckless. The nation's population had exploded since the Revolution, swelling past 15 million. Every year, new settlers tramped westward, wagons creaking under barrels of flour, iron tools, and the eternal hope of finding fortune on the frontier. Towns that had been little more than muddy crossroads in 1820 were bustling centers by 1830, filled with brick storefronts, schoolhouses and churches ringing bells over the prairie. The Erie Canal had turned New York into a titan of trade, with cargo boats carrying wheat, lumber, and whiskey from the interior to Manhattan's docks. Cotton, white gold from the south, poured through these channels and made merchants rich. On the surface, America looked unstoppable. Banks, though calling them banks, might be generous, sprang up like weeds. Almost anyone with enough friends and a rented office could charter one. They issued their own notes, pretty slips of paper with engraved eagles and solemn promises that each was backed by silver or gold. In truth, many had little more than a few boxes of coins in their vaults, hardly enough to redeem even a fraction of what they printed. Yet no one wanted to check too closely. A blacksmith in Kentucky might accept bills from a Pennsylvania bank he had never heard of, trusting that someone else would honor them. For years, people played along, as if the paper itself had magical powers. The real fever, however, was land. Western Territory Ohio's fertile valleys, the deep forests of Michigan, the rolling prairies of Illinois, and the rough hills of Arkansas was being surveyed and sold by the federal government. To buy was to dream. Clerks in Boston saved pennies to bid on plots they had never seen. Storekeepers in Philadelphia pawned furniture to invest in acres they imagined doubling, even tripling in value within a year. Land offices hosted auctions that resembled gambling halls. Men in dusty coats pressed shoulder to shoulder, waving crumpled bills, shouting over one another while clerks frantically scribbled bids. The air was hot, the floor sticky with tobacco juice, and yet the crowd roared with excitement, each convinced they had grabbed the winning ticket in America's great lottery. Newspapers and pamphlets fanned the flames. Stories circulated of a man who bought 100 acres in Illinois for 50 cents an acre, and sold them a year later for $5 each. Land is the surest investment, a popular broadside declared, for the Almighty is not making any more of it. The slogan spread from taverns in Albany to steamboats on the Mississippi. Even modest farmers repeated it as gospel. At Sunday dinners, fathers lectured sons that the path to fortune was not through toil in the fields, but through buying land and holding it until the next eager fool came along. In New York City, brokers and speculators filled coffee houses with excited chatter. Prices for Manhattan lots rose absurdly. Tiny plots on the northern end of the island, once pasture for goats, suddenly sold for thousands of dollars. One contemporary remarked that buying land in New York was like owning a ticket in a lottery. That never failed. Even men who had never seen a cow pasture believed they could become land barons. One tailor abandoned his trade entirely, declaring that cloth is for those who labor, land is for those who rise. Meanwhile, ordinary life reflected the boom. Goods poured into markets, bolts of calico cloth, imported sugar from the Caribbean, barrels of salted pork from Ohio. In New Orleans, a pound of coffee might cost 12 cents. In Boston, a barrel of flour sold for $5, only slightly higher than a few years before. People had money to spend, or rather, paper that passed as money, and they spent it freely. Taverns were noisy, theaters crowded, and ferries groaned under the weight of commuters. Optimism hummed in the air, as if the nation had discovered a secret recipe for endless growth. And yet, cracks were already visible to anyone willing to squint. Some banks issued far more notes than they could ever redeem. Farmers mortgaged their future crops to buy land, betting everything on good weather and high prices. Many lots sold at inflated values, but lay empty, unplowed, and forgotten, waiting for an ex-buyer who might never come. Critics muttered that speculation was turning honest Americans into gamblers, but their warnings were drowned out by the joyous chorus of profit. Looking back, it feels eerily familiar. The frenzy of land sales in 1830s America is not so different from the housing boom of the early 2000s, when suburban homes seemed destined only to rise in price. Then, as now, everyone believed they could not lose. Then, as now, they were wrong. And, hey, if you're still with me, wide awake, drop a 1 in the comments. If you've drifted off and just woke up, drop a 1 anyway. I'll count it. If land was the stage upon which Americans placed their boldest bets, then money was the grease that made the wheels spin wildly. But in the 1830s, money itself was a slippery thing, often more a matter of faith than fact. Walk into a shop in Cincinnati or a tavern in St. Louis, and you'd see a stack of note-screenish slips of paper, some crisply printed with elegant engravings, others looking as if they'd been run off on a schoolboy's press. Each carried the promise that it could be exchanged for specie, the solemn word for hard money, gold or silver coins. But whether that promise meant anything depended entirely on the bank that issued it. And many banks were little more than storefronts, with a safe, a few clerks, and a grand name like the Merchants and Mechanics Bank of Upper Mississippi. Ordinary people had to live in this forest of paper. A farmer selling wheat might be paid with notes from 3 different banks, none of them in his county. If he tried to use them at the local store, the shopkeeper might accept them at a discount, 70 cents on the dollar. Maybe 50 if the issuing bank had a questionable reputation. In the worst cases, a man could discover that the notes in his pocket had already become worthless because the bank had failed. There were horror stories of widows finding their life savings reduced to scraps of paper overnight, and merchants traveling days only to be laughed at when they tried to exchange foreign notes. Yet the nation's appetite for credit was insatiable. Banks, sensing profit, shoveled out loans like candy. Men borrowed to buy land, borrowed to build mills, borrowed to speculate in cotton. Some even borrowed simply to pay the interest on earlier debts, trusting that tomorrow's profits would cover today's risk. It was a dance of confidence, where the music only played as long as everyone believed it would never stop. The culture of the time reflected this easy money. Steamboats along the Mississippi carried not just cargo, but barrels of rumor, which banks were solid, which were shaky, which notes were being refused in Louisville or Nashville. Travelers swapped stories in smoky cabins, passing around bills and peering at signatures like fortune tellers reading palms. Newspapers printed elaborate tables listing the discount rates of dozens of banks, as if ordinary farmers could keep track of such complexity. In truth, most people simply trusted and hoped. One telling example came from New York in 1836. A clerk named William Hazard, barely 22 years old, took his modest savings and borrowed heavily to invest in land near Buffalo. The bank that lent him the money issued handsome notes decorated with an eagle so fierce it looked ready to claw through the paper. Within a year, the bank had folded. Hazard's savings vanished, his debt remained, and his dream of becoming a landowner ended with him back at his father's shop, sweeping floors instead of surveying acres. His story was not unique. It was America in miniature. Meanwhile, hard money, actual gold and silver, was increasingly scarce. Coins jingled less often in pockets. They were hoarded by those who distrusted paper. Merchants in New Orleans or Philadelphia might insist on specie for large transactions, but for most everyday exchanges, flimsy notes ruled. It was a system built on confidence. Yet every rumor of a failing bank chipped at that confidence like water eroding stone. Still, the mood remained buoyant. Americans were in love with growth, with the idea that tomorrow would always be richer than today. Skeptics were mocked as cowards. A Cincinnati editor scoffed in 1835, "Who shall fear a collapse when the tide of fortune flows so boldly?" The question would be answered all too soon. If you're thinking this sounds suspiciously like a Ponzi scheme with barns and cornfields, you're not wrong. Paper money that might or might not be real, loans stacked on loans, and everyone betting on land values that soared only because everyone else was buying it, was speculation dressed up as progress. And like all such schemes, it could only last as long as the trust held firm. If you've ever been handed a coupon and wondered if it was worth anything, drop a 2 in the comments. That's basically what Americans carried in their wallets back then. If paper money was the lifeblood of the 1830s economy, then Western land was the fever in its veins. The United States government, eager to transform wilderness into farms and towns, regularly surveyed new territories and opened them for sale. These auctions were meant to encourage settlement and honest farming. Instead, they became a national casino. Picture a land office in Illinois on a sweltering summer day of 1835. Farmers in wide-brimmed hats, merchants in dusty boots, and sharp-eyed speculators crowd into a clapboard building. The clerk, sweat rolling down his temple, calls out the lots. 80 acres here, 160 there. Voices rise, papers flutter, and bids leap higher with each shout. The atmosphere is less sober business than carnival men jostling, swearing, even shoving as they scramble to secure their little slice of the American dream. Some buyers truly wanted to farm. They pictured cabins of rough-hewn logs, cornfields waving in the wind, children running barefoot through the grass. But many more were in it for profit. They never intended to see the land, let alone work it. They bought purely on speculation. Pay a few dollars now, wait for the rush of settlers, and sell later at 10 times the price. It was the original flipping, long before houses in Florida or condos in Las Vegas. Newspapers made it sound effortless. An Ohio Gazette told of a shoemaker who invested his meager savings in frontier land, then resold it within 2 years to a wealthy newcomer, making more than he would have earned in a lifetime of cobbling boots. Such tales spread like wildfire, filling taverns with excited chatter. In the words of one frontier preacher, Men speak more of land than of heaven. Prices soared beyond reason. In Mississippi, fertile cotton lands that had sold for $2 an acre in 1830 fetched over $10 by 1836. Speculators in New York City pooled money to buy entire counties in Arkansas, sight unseen. Families mortgaged their farms too, buy additional acreage, convinced that owning land even in distant territories they might never visit was the surest path to wealth. The fever was not confined to the ambitious few. It infected nearly everyone. The federal government profited handsomely, at least in the short term. Millions of acres were sold, and the treasury brimmed with revenue. Politicians bragged that America had discovered a formula for prosperity: sell land, expand westward, and let private ambition do the rest. They ignored the warning signs. Land that changed hands 3 or 4 times in as many months sat uncultivated. Farmers who overextended themselves struggled to pay back loans when crops failed or prices dipped. Banks, giddy with profit, extended credit to anyone with a signature and a dream. There were moments of absurd comedy. One story tells of a grocer in Philadelphia who, swept up by speculation, purchased 1,000 acres in Michigan. When a friend asked if he planned to move west, he laughed. "Good heavens, no. I wouldn't recognize my land if I tripped over it. I'll sell it to some fool who does." The remark, meant as a joke, captured the mood of the age. Meanwhile, genuine settlers sometimes paid the price. A poor family might scrape together savings to buy a plot, only to find it already claimed by speculators who demanded triple the government price. In this way, the fever distorted the original purpose of expansion. Rather than filling the frontier with working farms, it filled eastern cities with men trading deeds like poker chips. Looking back, the parallels are uncanny. Substitute land deeds for tech stocks or cryptocurrency, and the pattern is the same. Everyone believes the boom will last forever. Everyone tells stories of quick fortunes. Everyone thinks they are smarter than the last fool. And when the music stops, it is usually the ordinary family, the shoemaker, the farmer, the widow left, holding worthless scraps. By 1836, the mania reached a peak. Acres were changing hands faster than anyone could track, and credit was stretched to the breaking point. Some sober observers began to worry, whispering that the bubble could not last, but their voices were drowned out by the chorus of optimism. For the moment, America was too busy dreaming to notice the cracks in its foundations. If you think you might have been tempted to buy land in 1836, just because everyone else was doing it, be honest and drop a 3 in the comments. Don't worry. You'd have plenty of company if the fever of the land sales raged hottest in the West. The pulse of speculation beat loudest in New York City. By the mid-1830s, Manhattan was the nerve center of the young nation's economy. Its crowded wharves and noisy markets, the place where fortunes were made on, lost almost overnight. To stroll down Wall Street in 1836 was to walk through a carnival of ambition. Brokers shouted bids from doorways, clerks ran with armfuls of papers, and coffeehouses thrummed with deals hammered out over steaming mugs. It was a world where the smell of tobacco smoke and ink mixed with the heady perfume of greed. The city's newspapers fed the frenzy daily. The New York Herald and Evening Post published endless columns on rising land values, booming trade, and the boundless promise of America. The word panic was nowhere in sight. Instead, headlines shouted of unprecedented prosperity and fortunes made in a day. Readers gobbled it up, their imaginations lit by stories of ordinary men who had leaped into speculation and come out rich. The public wanted heroes of success, not prophets of doom. In coffeehouses along Broadway, land deeds passed from hand to hand like playing cards. A clerk who earned $5 a week might boast that he had secured an interest in Arkansas lands that would surely triple in value before the year was out. Tailors, grocers, even school teachers bought shares in speculative ventures. One astonished visitor remarked that New York seemed less a city of merchants than a city of speculators, where no one wished to labor when fortune could be snatched. In a gamble, real estate within the city itself turned frenzied. Northern Manhattan, still dotted with farms and pastures, saw lots sell for astronomical prices. A single acre on the outskirts could fetch thousands of dollars, more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. Yet buyers lined up eagerly, persuaded that the island's growth was limitless. Buy now or regret later, brokers urged, and people obeyed. Even the culture of leisure reflected the mania. Theaters staged plays, lampooning foolish speculators, only for audiences, many of them speculators themselves, to roar with laughter and applause. Cartoonists sketched caricatures of plump bankers shoveling notes into the hands of wild-eyed farmers. But rather than take offense, readers bought the prints as souvenirs. It was as if the entire city knew it was dancing on a tightrope, but enjoyed the thrill too much to stop. Of course, not everyone was fooled. A few cautious voices warned of danger. The New York Times, still a fledgling paper, then ran editorials, suggesting that unchecked banking and reckless loans could end badly. Some churchmen preached sermons against the sin of greed, declaring that speculation was gambling disguised as patriotism. But such words fell flat in a society intoxicated by the prospect of easy gain. Who wanted to hear about prudence when everyone else seemed to be getting rich? The city's social fabric reflected the widening gap between classes. Successful speculators flaunted their wealth, riding carriages down Broadway, building ornate, brownstone houses, and dressing in fine imported clothes. Meanwhile, laborers and dock hands found wages rising only modestly, even as rents climbed. For the poor, the boom was less opportunity than a rising tide that threatened to sweep them away. But hope is infectious. Many still believed that one lucky investment might lift them from obscurity. One poignant diary entry from 1836 tells of a seamstress named Elisa, who scraped together savings to buy a small share in western lands through a local broker. She wrote of her dream to leave the drudgery of sewing and open a shop of her own. "If this venture prospers," she penned, "I shall never touch needle and thread again." Her story, like thousands of others, captures the lure of speculation, the hope of escape, the belief that fortune was just one gamble away. Looking back, we can see the dangerous irony. New York in the 1830s thought itself a beacon of prosperity, a city where the future could only shine brighter. Yet the very energy that made it thrive, the hunger for more, the worship of speculation, the careless trust in paper promises, was laying the groundwork for catastrophe. The city of speculators was building castles not on sand, but on paper. And the paper was already beginning to fray. If you think Wall Street today sounds suspiciously similar, drop a 4 in the comments. Maybe history doesn't repeat, but it sure likes to rhyme. By late 1836, the dream of endless prosperity still glittered in the public imagination, but if you looked closely, faint cracks had begun to show. Whispers of doubt drifted through markets, and merchants who had once shouted with confidence now spoke more cautiously, lowering their voices as though afraid the truth might jinx them. America, for all its boldness, had built a palace of speculation that rested on foundations of sand. One sign of trouble was the mounting debt of ordinary families. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to purchase new lands discovered that the profits were not arriving as quickly as they hoped. Cornfields withered under dry spells, cotton prices dipped unexpectedly, and buyers became scarce. Instead of paying off their loans, many scrambled just to meet the interest. In taverns across Ohio and Kentucky, conversations turned sour as men compared debts, shaking their heads at figures they barely understood. What had seemed like a harmless gamble now loomed like a storm cloud over their households. Banks, meanwhile, had become dangerously exposed. They had lent far more than they could possibly cover in hard coin, trusting that confidence would never waver. Vaults that ought to have held glittering piles of silver dollars contained only a meager supply, yet the stream of paper notes pouring from their presses never slowed. Any serious attempt by the public to redeem those notes for specie would reveal the hollow truth. The banks simply did not have the gold and silver to honor their promises. Merchants in the port cities began to feel the strain. Imports of cloth, iron, and sugar had surged during the boom years, financed by easy credit. But by the end of 1836, some foreign creditors in Britain grew wary. They demanded payment in hard money rather than paper. American traders, suddenly forced to scrape together specie, found themselves squeezed. Ships sat longer at docks, goods went unpaid, and rumors trickled back to Wall Street that English bankers were losing patience with their brash American cousins. Even ordinary city dwellers noticed changes. In New York, bread prices inched higher, rents crept upward, and whispers spread of small businesses folding quietly in the night. A cobbler who once kept 3 apprentices now kept only 1. A tailor who boasted of his land investments grew nervous when buyers hesitated. Behind the cheerful headlines of prosperity, there was a growing sense that the music might be slowing. President Andrew Jackson, still lionized by his supporters, complicated matters further. His war on the Bank of the United States, his insistence on hard money, and his issuance of the Specie Circular, decree requiring government land purchases to be paid in gold or silver, tightened the noose. Suddenly, men who had grown accustomed to buying land on easy credit found themselves scrambling for coins. But coins were scarce, and without them, the speculative machine began to sputter. The very decree meant to safeguard stability planted seeds of chaos. Some contemporary observers saw disaster looming. A Boston merchant wrote in his journal that December, the land mania cannot continue. There is too much paper, too little coin, and too much faith in shadows. But such voices were drowned by the louder chorus of optimism. The nation had become skilled at ignoring bad news. If a bank closed, there was always another opening down the street. If cotton prices dipped, surely they would rebound tomorrow. If a man lost his fortune in speculation, well, perhaps he had simply played the game poorly. Few admitted that the entire game was rigged to collapse. For the poor, cracks in the dream appeared in sharper relief. A widow in Pennsylvania, living on her late husband's savings, discovered that the notes she kept hidden in a wooden box were being rejected by shopkeepers. They called them bad bills. She wept as she tried to trade them for food, only to be told they were worthless. Her plight was not unique. Stories like hers multiplied as weaker banks began to fail quietly, leaving ordinary people stranded. And yet, in parlors and taverns, optimism still carried the day. Toasts were raised to America's future. Men boasted of their paper fortunes, and editors continued to trumpet the nation's boundless prospects. The cracks were there for all to see, but the crowd preferred to look away. It was easier to believe the dream would last forever than to face the possibility of ruin. In truth, the collapse was already underway. The nation's financial system, built on faith, was like a great bridge swaying under too much weight. Every new loan, every land deed, every piece of worthless paper added strain. And when the final gust of wind arrived, as it soon would, the bridge would not bend. It would break. If you've ever ignored bad signs because hope felt easier, drop a 5 in the comments. You're in good company with half of America in 1836. To understand the panic of 1837, one must first understand the man who set much of the stage, Andrew Jackson, known as Old Hickory for his unbending will and battlefield toughness. Jackson was not the kind of politician who blended into the crowd. He was tall, gaunt, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to burn through anyone foolish enough to cross him. To his supporters, he was the hero of New Orleans, the self-made man who rose from orphaned poverty to the presidency. To his enemies, he was a stubborn tyrant, a man who ruled more like a general than a statesman. Either way, his presence dominated American politics in the 1830s. Jackson distrusted elites. He had lived his youth among ordinary farmers and frontier fighters, and he never forgot how wealth and privilege seemed concentrated in the hands of the few. He carried a personal grudge against banks from early in life. As a young man in Tennessee, he had nearly gone bankrupt due to a bad loan and land speculation gone wrong. To him, banks were tools of the rich that preyed upon honest working men. That scar never healed, and when he reached the presidency in 1829, it shaped nearly every financial policy he pursued. At the center of his suspicion stood the Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816 to Jackson. It was a monster, a vast institution headquartered in Philadelphia, but reaching into every corner of the nation's economy. With branches scattered across states, it regulated currency, collected federal revenues, and checked the reckless printing of notes by smaller banks. Supporters claimed it provided stability. Jackson saw only corruption. He believed it allowed wealthy Eastern elites to manipulate the nation's finances for their own gain, while the farmers and workers he championed carried the burden. His animosity toward the bank was not subtle. At rallies, Jackson thundered that the bank was dangerous to the liberties of the people. He accused it of bribing congressmen, buying elections, and holding the government hostage with its immense financial power. His language was fiery, but it resonated with ordinary Americans who distrusted institutions that seemed too big, too distant, and too powerful. For them, Jackson was not just a president. He was a crusader, cutting down a dragon. The battle came to a head in 1832, when Henry Clay and Nicholas Biddle, the bank's president, pushed for an early renewal of its charter. Clay, Jackson's rival, hoped to corner him. If Jackson vetoed the renewal, Clay believed it would cost him re-election. Instead, Jackson seized the moment. With a dramatic veto, he declared the bank unconstitutional, dangerous, and unjust. His message to Congress thundered: "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." The veto electrified his supporters, and far from costing him the election, it helped him win a resounding second term. The veto was only the beginning. In 1833, Jackson escalated the war. He ordered federal deposits removed from the bank and placed into various state banks, his so-called pet banks. Critics accused him of abusing executive power, but Jackson shrugged off the outrage. To him, it was a necessary strike against tyranny, yet the effect was destabilizing. With federal funds withdrawn, the Bank of the United States lost its restraining influence. The pet banks, many poorly managed, suddenly had more money than they knew what to do with, and they poured it into loans, land speculation, and reckless expansion. In the short term, Jackson's victory looked glorious. Crowds cheered, newspapers printed songs praising Old Hickory, and his allies painted him as the champion of democracy. But beneath the triumph, trouble brewed. By destroying the bank that had served as a stabilizing force, Jackson had unleashed a storm of unchecked speculation. The very abuses he despised in smaller banks multiplied, their paper flooding the economy without oversight. Still, Jackson was not a man to doubt himself. He carried himself with the certainty of a general, convinced that his instincts were right, and that his enemies were always plotting against him. To the end of his presidency, he celebrated the death of the bank as one of his greatest victories. But like many victories won in the heat of battle, its costs would come due later. It would be the American people, not Jackson, who paid the price. If you've ever made a bold decision just to prove your rival wrong, drop a 6 in the comments. Jackson would have approved. When Andrew Jackson struck down the Second Bank of the United States, he didn't simply topple an institution. He shattered the only real dam holding back the flood of speculation. In its place, he entrusted federal deposits to a patchwork of smaller institutions across the country, quickly nicknamed pet banks. These banks were supposed to be guardians of the people's money, friendly to democracy, and immune to the corruption of wealthy elites. In reality, many were little more than local ventures run by ambitious men who suddenly found themselves holding vast sums of government cash. Imagine being a modest banker in Ohio or Georgia, accustomed to counting pennies, when one morning a shipment of federal deposits arrived in your vault. Overnight, your little establishment became a powerhouse. Temptation was irresistible. With money to lend, banks opened their windows wide, extending credit to farmers, merchants, and speculators who came knocking. Loans poured out for land purchases, canal projects, railroads, and even wild personal ventures. If you could scrawl your name on a slip of paper, chances were good a banker would hand you cash. This tidal wave of easy credit fed directly into the land mania already gripping the nation. Speculators descended on auctions with fistfuls of notes borrowed from pet banks, driving prices skyward. Land that had seemed cheap just a year earlier now sold for staggering sums. Western towns boomed as if touched by magic, with new buildings rising, new shops opening, and everyone convinced the future would only shine brighter. But the pet banks lacked discipline. Unlike the second bank, which at least tried to regulate lending and curb excess, these state banks had little oversight. Many were run by political allies of Jackson, chosen less for financial prudence than for loyalty. Corruption flourished. Some bank directors lent generously to themselves, financing private speculations with public funds. Others played favorites, rewarding political friends while leaving ordinary borrowers with crumbs. The sheer volume of paper notes in circulation became staggering. By 1836, the economy was awash with banknotes, some legitimate, others dubious. Merchants struggled to keep track of which were good and which were bad. Entire businesses sprouted just to evaluate the trustworthiness of notes, publishing pamphlets, known as banknote reporters, that listed discounts and warnings. A farmer might check one of these guides before accepting payment, only to find the bills in his hand worth far less than their printed value. Confusion was the norm. For ordinary people, this chaos sometimes felt like opportunity. Suddenly, money seemed easy. Families that had once counted every penny found themselves flush with borrowed cash. They bought extra land, new tools, even luxuries like imported cloth or fine furniture. In cities, taverns and theaters boomed as customers spent freely. Optimism was intoxicating, and few wanted to ask whether the party could last. Yet sharp-eyed observers noticed the flaws. Gold and silver specie were becoming scarce. Banks issued notes far beyond their reserves, gambling that depositors would never demand full redemption. But when someone did, when a merchant insisted on hard money for a large transaction, banks sometimes stalled or refused outright. The illusion of prosperity depended entirely on confidence. If trust cracked, the whole system could unravel. Jackson himself, ironically, worried about this. Though he hated the second bank, he was no fool. He distrusted paper money and believed true wealth lay in gold and silver. In 1836, his administration issued the Specie Circular, a decree requiring payment for government land in hard coin rather than notes. The intention was noble to restrain speculation and force discipline on the banks. The effect, however, was disastrous. Demand for specie surged, draining coins from already thin reserves. Pet banks, stripped of their credibility, began to wobble. Ordinary Americans didn't see the mechanics. They saw only that money which had flowed so easily was suddenly harder to grasp. Land sales faltered, credit tightened, and whispers spread that some banks were not as sound as they claimed. The same crowds that had cheered Jackson's victory over the monster bank began to feel unease. Yet the president remained unbowed, convinced that he had struck a blow for liberty. The rise of the pet banks was, in truth, less a triumph of democracy than a triumph of chaos. By dismantling a central authority and scattering its powers to the winds, Jackson had unintentionally unleashed forces he could not control. America was about to discover that destroying a monster sometimes only breeds a pack of smaller ones. If you think this sounds suspiciously like politicians today, claiming to fight corruption while handing favors to their friends, type A7 in the comments. History may not repeat itself exactly, but it sure loves familiar characters. By the mid-1830s, America was a gambler's paradise, with Jackson's pet banks flooding the nation with paper notes and credit flowing more freely than whiskey at a frontier tavern. Speculation became not just an economic activity, but a way of life. Everywhere one looked, men and women were wagering on the future, buying land they had never seen, trading commodities they had never touched, and borrowing money they could not possibly repay. It was a national fever, and it burned hot. Consider the Mississippi Valley, where cotton was king. Planters borrowed heavily from local banks, betting that Europe's insatiable demand would keep prices rising forever. With borrowed funds, they bought more land and more enslaved laborers to work at multiplying production. On paper, the numbers looked dazzling, but when prices dipped even slightly, the entire pyramid began to wobble. Many planters had mortgaged everything they owned: plantations, tools, even the lives of enslaved people, just to buy more land. A single bad harvest could topple them into ruin. Meanwhile, in cities like New York and Philadelphia, speculation took on a different flavor. Land deeds for western tracts traded hands as briskly as stocks. Brokers filled coffee houses, waving papers and shouting bids, as if they were selling shares in some golden future. A man might buy land in Illinois in the morning and sell it that same afternoon without ever leaving Manhattan. To him the land was less soil and trees than numbers on a ledger, token in the grand game. Ordinary Americans were swept up in the frenzy. Farmers who once measured wealth in hogs and bushels now boasted of acres they owned on maps hundreds of miles away. Clerks and shopkeepers invested their modest savings in speculative ventures, dreaming of escape from daily toil. Even housewives, urged on by optimistic husbands, sometimes staked dowries or inheritance money on western deeds. Everyone wanted a ticket to the promised riches. The atmosphere was surreal. Newspapers brimmed with stories of fortunes made overnight. A blacksmith in Ohio was said to have bought a patch of wilderness for 50 cents an acre and sold it months later for 10 times the price. Tales like these spread by word of mouth, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. They created an illusion that luck and daring were all it took to transform ordinary lives into gilded ones. Banks encouraged the mania. Pet banks, swollen with federal deposits, lent freely with little concern for repayment. Some extended loans to men whose only collateral was confidence and charm. One banker later confessed that in 1836 he approved loans as readily as a barkeep pours whiskey, a line that could have been the motto of the era. With so much credit sloshing around, prices inflated, and the illusion of prosperity deepened. Yet beneath the euphoria, danger brewed. Speculation does not create real wealth. It merely reshuffles paper claims on it, as land and cotton prices soared beyond reasonable value. The disconnect between fantasy and reality widened. Observers who dared to point this out were dismissed as pessimists. One Boston editor warned that the mania could not last, writing, "We have inflated our prosperity with paper and delusion." His words were ignored. Nobody wanted to spoil the party. Life in the cities reflected both the boom and its distortions. On Broadway, new theaters opened, carriages paraded in lavish display, and shop windows glittered with imported goods. But alongside the spectacle was unease. Rents climbed, Food prices crept upward, and the poor struggled to keep pace. While speculators toasted their paper fortunes with champagne, dockworkers tightened their belts. Prosperity was not evenly shared, and the divide between winners and losers widened daily. Speculation fever also seeped into politics. State legislatures, eager to fuel growth, granted charters for new banks, canals, and railroads with reckless enthusiasm. Many of these projects were more fantasy than reality, started with borrowed money and abandoned when funds ran dry. Legislators boasted of progress, but the truth was that America was building castles in the air, financed by promises no one could keep. The irony was that Jackson himself, who had fought the monster bank to protect ordinary people from elite manipulation, had unwittingly unleashed a far more chaotic monster. Instead of one powerful institution, there were now hundreds of reckless ones. Instead of corruption concentrated in Philadelphia, it was scattered across the nation. In destroying what he saw as tyranny, Jackson had scattered seeds of disorder. By 1836, America was riding high on this wave of speculation. The streets bustled, the presses shouted of prosperity, and the nation congratulated itself on boundless success. Few realized that the higher the fever burned, the more violent the eventual collapse would be. If you've ever watched friends dive into a get-rich-quick scheme and thought, "This can't end well," type an 8 in the comments. You'd have fit right in on Wall Street in 1836. By 1836, the speculative fire that had engulfed America was blazing out of control. Land sales reached staggering heights, with millions of acres changing hands each year. Pet banks churned out paper notes, faster than printers could ink them. Prices soared, credit ballooned, and confidence seemed unshakable. But Andrew Jackson, ever distrustful of paper promises, believed he saw danger ahead. To him, prosperity built on flimsy banknotes was no prosperity at all. It was a house of cards. His answer came in the form of a single policy that would shake the nation to its core: the Specie Circular, issued in July 1836. The Specie Circular was deceptively simple. It declared that from that point onward, all purchases of public land must be paid for in hard money, gold, or silver coins rather, than in banknotes. To Jackson, it was a common-sense measure. Land speculation was raging unchecked, fueled by worthless paper. If buyers had to pay in real coin, he reasoned, the fever would cool, speculation would shrink, and honest farmers would have a fair chance. Jackson believed he was protecting the people, but the reality was far harsher. Coins were scarce even before the order, and now demand for them skyrocketed. Land buyers who had borrowed stacks of paper notes from pet banks suddenly found themselves unable to pay. Banks, desperate to meet redemption demands, scrambled to gather specie, hoarding what little they had and refusing to lend more. Credit, once flowing like a river, froze almost overnight. The effects rippled quickly. In Western land offices, clerks reported a sharp drop in sales as buyers arrived with paper only to be turned away. Speculators, unable to pay with specie, abandoned their claims. Some lost everything they had borrowed. Farmers, too, felt the squeeze. Those who had mortgaged themselves to buy land with paper notes suddenly faced ruin when the government refused to accept their money. In the cities, panic began to stir. Merchants who had accepted notes at full value found themselves holding paper that buyers no longer trusted. Shops grew cautious, demanding gold and silver instead of paper. A New York grocer recorded in his ledger, "Notes, which last week purchased. A barrel of flour are this week refused." Prices for basic goods wobbled as uncertainty spread. Jackson's opponents seized on the chaos. Henry Clay thundered in Congress that the Specie Circular was a measure of madness, accusing the president of strangling commerce. Newspapers hostile to Jackson filled their pages with scathing attacks. blaming him personally for the tightening credit and rising anxiety. To his critics, the Specie Circular was proof that Jackson cared more for his vendetta against banks than for the well-being of the people. Yet Jackson stood firm. To his mind, the suffering was not caused by his policy, but by the reckless banks that had flooded the nation with worthless paper. If the people were angry, they should be angry at those institutions, not at the president who had tried to safeguard them. His stubbornness, admired by some, infuriated others. For ordinary Americans, such debates mattered little compared to the daily struggle. Farmers found themselves unable to sell crops for reliable payment. Workers noticed layoffs as businesses slowed. Land prices, once only rising, began to fall. The optimism of the boom years dimmed, replaced by a nervous sense that the tide was turning. The irony was cruel. Jackson had set out to curb speculation, and in that sense, he succeeded. But he did so by yanking the supports out from under an economy already teetering on imbalance. What followed was less a cooling of fever than a plunge into collapse. In the winter of 1836, one Philadelphia merchant wrote in his diary, "Gold and silver are locked away. Notes passed like rumors, sometimes taken, sometimes refused. All men speak of trouble, but none dare call it ruin." His words captured the fragile moment, the pause before the storm. The dominoes were wobbling, and soon they would fall. If you think forcing everyone to suddenly switch to hard money only sounds like pulling the plug at the worst possible moment, type a 9 in the comments. Jackson believed it was a cure-but for many Americans. It felt like the beginning of the disease. By the time Andrew Jackson left office in March 1837, the stage was set for disaster. To his supporters, he departed as a conquering hero, the man who had slain the monster bank of the United States and restored power to the people. Crowds cheered, newspapers printed tributes, and admirers praised his courage in defying wealthy elites. Yet beneath the jubilation, cracks in the economy had widened into fissures. His bank war had not destroyed corruption, had scattered it across the nation, multiplying its reach. The pet banks that now held federal deposits were unstable, their paper notes of uncertain value. The Specie Circular had drained gold and silver from circulation, creating a liquidity crisis. Foreign creditors, especially in Britain, were tightening their grip, demanding payment in specie rather than notes. America, flush with paper but short on real coin, was running on fumes. Jackson's policies, meant to restore honesty and discipline, had instead unleashed chaos. Still, Jackson never doubted himself. In retirement at the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation, he basked in the adoration of his allies. He insisted that his fight against the bank was righteous, that he had saved the Republic from tyranny. To critics, who blamed him for economic turmoil, he responded with disdain. If banks failed, it was because they had been reckless. If merchants suffered, it was because they had trusted paper instead of coin. To the end, Jackson's certainty was ironclad. But history has a cruel way of measuring leaders, not by their intentions, but by their consequences. Within weeks of Jackson's departure, the Panic of 1837 erupted. Banks suspended payments, businesses collapsed, and ordinary Americans faced ruin. His successor, Martin Van Buren, inherited the storm and bore the blame, while Jackson, comfortably retired, watched events unfold with grim satisfaction. To him, the suffering only proved that he had been right all along. Paper money was poison. The irony was bitter. Jackson had promised to protect the common man from exploitation by elites. Yet it was the common man, the farmer, the laborer, the shopkeeper, who paid the heaviest price for the collapse. Wealthy speculators sometimes weathered the storm, but ordinary families saw savings vanish and jobs disappear. In trying to slay one monster, Jackson had unleashed many others, and it was the people he claimed to defend who bore the scars. The legacy of the bank war remains contested even today. Admirers still point to Jackson's courage in challenging entrenched financial power. They celebrate his refusal to bow to Nicholas Biddle, Henry Clay, or any of the other grandees who sought to preserve the bank. They see in him a democratic spirit, a man who would not let government become hostage to private interests. Critics, however, argued that Jackson's victory was Pyrrhic. By destroying a central institution that provided stability, he destabilized the economy at the worst possible moment. His stubborn adherence to hard money and distrust of banks, while principled in theory, proved disastrous in practice. Ordinary Americans of the 1830s had no luxury of academic debate. They lived the consequences. Some saw farms repossessed. Some watched businesses close. Some begged for work in city streets. To them, the bank war was not a noble crusade, but the prelude to ruin. A New York mechanic, interviewed years later, recalled bitterly, "We cheered Jackson when he whipped the bank, but it was our families that paid the price." Looking back, the episode offers a sobering lesson. Economic systems are delicate. Their prosperity built not just on laws or coins, but on confidence. Jackson, with his soldier's mindset, believed that victory over an institution would solve the problem. But economies do not obey battlefield logic. Destroying one enemy only reshuffled the battlefield, unleashing unintended consequences. And yet, Jackson's shadow lingers. Even today, debates over central banks, currency, and government power echo the quarrels of the 1830s. Was Jackson a champion of democracy or a reckless demagogue? Was the bank war a victory for liberty or a disaster for stability? The answers depend on where one chooses to stand. What cannot be denied is the drama of it all. A fiery president, a hated institution, a nation intoxicated by speculation, and a policy that tipped the balance from boom to bust. Jackson's legacy is inseparable from the panic of 1837. His triumph turned to tragedy not for himself, but for the millions of Americans who woke up to find their prosperity collapsed like a row of dominoes. If you think history is full of leaders who win their battles but leave their people to suffer the aftermath, type a 10 in the comments. Andrew Jackson would probably shrug, insist he was still right. On the morning of May 10, 1837, New Yorkers awoke to an eerie silence that seemed out of place in the nation's busiest city. The usual bustle of carts and clamor of merchants was broken by lines of anxious men outside banks. Doors that had always swung open with confidence were now bolted shut. Tellers refused withdrawals. Clerks shook their heads. For the first time in living memory, the money was simply gone. The shock rippled through the city like a stone striking water. Merchants rushed to secure payment, only to find that their notes were worthless. Shopkeepers who had sold goods on credit discovered that their customers could no longer pay. Farmers arriving at the docks with wagons of produce were turned away because buyers lacked real money. In an instant, confidence, the invisible glue holding the economy together, dissolved. Crowds gathered on Wall Street, the air thick with anger and confusion. Some shouted accusations at bankers, others begged for loans or begged for coin. A few grew violent, pounding fists against locked doors or hurling stones at shuttered windows. Police were summoned to keep order, though they too were bewildered. What good was law when the lifeblood of commerce had frozen? Newspapers captured the chaos. The New York Herald reported, "Never in the memory of our citizens has there been such consternation. Businessmen are ruined, mechanics thrown idle, and the very currency of the nation annihilated." Another paper described Wall Street as a theater of despair, with men pacing like caged animals, staring at the ground as though searching for coins that might miraculously appear. The suspension of specie payments, that is, the refusal of banks to redeem notes in gold or silver, was the spark. Once one bank admitted it could not pay, Others followed in quick succession, unwilling to risk a fatal run on their vaults. Within days, banks across the country had shut their doors to withdrawals. Paper money, once passed freely, now carried suspicion. Merchants demanded payment in coin, but coins had vanished into hiding. The nation's great boom had collapsed into paralysis. For ordinary workers, the panic was immediate and brutal. Carpenters, dockhands, and seamstresses, who depended on steady wages, suddenly found themselves dismissed. Factories slowed or closed altogether as credit dried up. In New York alone, tens of thousands were thrown out of work within weeks. Bread lines formed, and soup kitchens struggled to feed the hungry. A loaf of bread that had cost 6 cents now soared to 12, beyond the reach of many families. Mothers pawned clothes, fathers begged for day labor, children went barefoot. In streets that only months before had hummed with prosperity. The collapse was not confined to the city. News spread swiftly along canals and railroads, reaching inland. Towns in Ohio, farmers discovered that the notes they had saved from local banks were worthless. In Mississippi, cotton planters faced ruin as creditors demanded specie they did not possess. In frontier settlements, land deeds once traded for fortunes now lay useless in trunks, paper reminders of vanished wealth. From New Orleans to Boston, the same story unfolded. Businesses shuttered, debts called in, families ruined. The panic also carried a psychological toll. Americans had believed their nation destined for boundless growth. They had boasted of limitless land, endless opportunity, and prosperity for all. Now that confidence collapsed. Letters from the time speak of despair and shame. One merchant confessed to his brother, "I cannot meet my debts. I walk the streets, a beggar where once I was respected." A farmer wrote, "My fields are rich, but I have no coin to pay my lender. I am ruined, though my land is good." It was a crisis, not only of money, but of faith in the very promise of America. The crash of 1837 was not a single event, but the unraveling of years of reckless speculation, weak banking, and harsh policy. The dominoes Jackson had tipped were finally falling, and as they fell, they crushed the dreams of millions. If you've ever felt the ground suddenly vanish beneath your feet, whether from losing a job, watching savings disappear, or seeing a promise broken, type an 11 in the comments. That's how America felt on that grim May morning in 1837. Once the banks in New York suspended specie payments in May 1837, the collapse spread with terrifying speed. Confidence, once shaken, proved impossible to restore. Within weeks, businesses that had looked solid as oak toppled like matchsticks. The crisis was not a single explosion, but a chain reaction, each failure dragging down another in its wake. Merchants were among the first to feel the shock. Many had extended credit generously during the boom years, trusting that sales and rising prices would cover debts. Now, customers could not pay, and the notes in merchants' hands were rejected. One dry goods dealer confessed, "I have a store full of wares and not a penny that will purchase bread." Bankruptcy notices filled the newspapers, and once shopkeepers were forced to shutter their doors. Manufacturing, too, ground to a halt. Factories that had sprung up to meet growing demand for cloth, tools, and furniture suddenly lost access to credit. Owners could not pay wages or purchase raw materials. In cities like Philadelphia and Lowell, mills fell silent. Thousands of workers, many of them women and children, were turned into the streets with no severance, no savings, and no safety net. Hunger and homelessness spread rapidly. Farmers, who had seemed the backbone of prosperity, suffered as well. Those who had borrowed heavily to purchase land or equipment found themselves unable to repay loans. Crops rotted in fields because there was no cash to transport or sell them. In parts of the Midwest, grain was so worthless that farmers burned it for fuel rather than ship it to market at a loss. Livestock was slaughtered and sold for pennies, barely enough to keep families alive through the winter. The cotton economy of the South, tied tightly to international trade, was especially hard hit. British merchants, wary of American instability, curtailed purchases. Prices plummeted. Planters who had leveraged themselves to the hilt faced foreclosure. Some lost plantations that had been in families for generations. In despair, one Mississippi planter reportedly declared, "I am lord of nothing but ashes." Everywhere, unemployment rose. In New York, estimates suggest that 1 in 3 workers was jobless by the winter of 1837 to 38. Bread lines snaked through city streets. Charities and churches tried to provide relief, but the scale of suffering overwhelmed them. Families who had once prided themselves on independence were reduced to begging. Newspapers carried heartbreaking stories of mothers offering children for adoption, unable to feed them. Violence sometimes flared. In Philadelphia, angry crowds smashed the windows of banks they blamed for the crisis. In New York, a mob attacked flour warehouses, convinced merchants were hoarding grain to drive up prices. Police clashed with rioters in the streets, and the National Guard was called out to restore order. Fear hung over the cities like smoke. For many Americans, the emotional toll was as devastating as the financial. Pride turned to humiliation. Men who had considered themselves respectable providers were crushed by debts they could never repay. Women who had hoped for security faced insecurity instead. Children went hungry in a nation that had boasted of abundance. The American dream, so loudly celebrated during the boom years, now felt like a cruel joke. Political blame flew in every direction. Supporters of Andrew Jackson insisted the crisis was the fault of greedy speculators and reckless banks. His critics, however, pointed squarely at Jackson's own policies as destruction of the second bank. His reliance on pet banks, his specie circular that demanded gold and silver when none could be found. The general has slain the monster, one satirical cartoon observed, and given birth to 1,000 serpents in its stead. In truth, the crisis had many fathers. Reckless lending, speculative mania, fragile banks, poor harvests in Europe, and tightening British credit all played roles. But for ordinary Americans, the nuances hardly mattered. What they knew was that the prosperity they had been promised had turned to ruin almost overnight. A Boston minister captured the mood in a sermon. "The Lord has withdrawn his favor, and we are humbled. The pride of wealth is gone, and we are left to learn again the virtues of patience and toil." His words, though clothed in piety, reflected a national despair. The people were groping for meaning in a catastrophe that seemed both sudden and senseless. If you've ever seen one person's failure set off a chain reaction that drags everyone down with them, type A12 in the comments. That was America in the summer of 1837, one domino falling after another, until the whole row lay in ruins. If the bank's collapse was the spark, the newspapers were the wind that fanned it into a firestorm. In the 1830s, Americans devoured newspapers with an appetite unmatched in the world. Every city had multiple dailies, and even frontier towns managed to circulate weeklies, packed with news, gossip, and fiery editorials. When the panic struck, these papers became both chroniclers of despair and amplifiers of fear. Headlines screamed of ruin. The New York Herald carried stories of once prosperous merchants, now reduced to penury in a fortnight. The Albany Journal warned its readers to beware of worthless banknotes. The Philadelphia Public Ledger printed long lists of bankruptcies, the names of once respected families now paraded as examples of financial folly. Each article added fuel to the sense that the world was collapsing. Editorials drew sharp political lines. Democratic papers, loyal to Andrew Jackson, and his successor, Martin Van Buren, insisted the panic was caused by British bankers tightening credit and by reckless speculators who had ignored Jackson's wise warnings. Whig papers, on the other hand, laid the disaster squarely at Jackson's feet. They painted him as a stubborn autocrat whose war on the bank and enforcement of the specie circular had triggered the collapse. One Whig cartoon depicted Jackson as a mad doctor, bleeding a patient labeled the economy until the man collapsed. For ordinary readers, the barrage of news was overwhelming. Farmers in Ohio scanned lists of failed banks, trying to learn if their notes were now worthless. Shopkeepers in New England clipped reports of falling prices to guess whether they should sell goods now or hoard them. Workers in New York read with horror that 1/3 of their fellow laborers were unemployed. The newspapers did not simply report events. They shaped the very way people understood the crisis. Letters to the editor poured in. Some pleaded for calm, urging neighbors not to abandon faith in paper money. Others raged against bankers, politicians, or foreigners. "The poor man is sacrificed to the rich," wrote one angry reader from Pennsylvania, "and the government is blind to his suffering." Another, from Tennessee, thundered that Jackson was a traitor to the very people he claimed to defend. These voices revealed a nation both fragmented and frightened. Newspapers also trafficked in rumor, sometimes recklessly. Reports of bank failures traveled faster than the truth, causing runs on institutions that might otherwise have survived. One New York paper mistakenly printed that a major insurance company had collapsed. Within hours, crowds gathered, demanding withdrawals, and by nightfall, the rumor had become reality. The firm, unable to meet sudden demands, shut its doors. Confidence, once shaken, rarely returned. Yet the press was not only a purveyor of fear, it was also a theater of satire. Cartoonists and columnists lampooned the panic, sketching desperate bankers, stuffing coins into carriages bound for Canada, or merchants clutching wheelbarrows of worthless notes. Humor was a coping mechanism, a way for readers to laugh through tears. One popular broadside depicted a farmer offering a banker a sack of potatoes in exchange for repayment, with the caption, "Specie enough for me." The sheer flood of information gave the panic a national character. In earlier times, a crisis might have remained local, with slow communication muting its reach. But in 1837, the rapid circulation of newspapers and the spread of the telegraph meant that fear traveled at lightning speed. A failure in New York could shake confidence in Missouri within days. Panic was contagious, and the press carried the infection. At the same time, newspapers became a rallying ground for political debate. Whigs used the panic to hammer Van Buren, branding him as Van Ruin. Democrats countered by insisting that only hard money policies could restore honesty to the system. Editorial battles spilled into taverns, churches, and even family dinners, where Americans argued not only about who was to blame, but also about what the nation's future should look like. One observer wrote, "We are a people who will debate ourselves into the grave. While our neighbors starve, we argue which party has the nobler principles." His sarcasm cut deep, but it reflected a truth. The panic had become as much about perception as reality. If you've ever seen media coverage turn a bad situation into a full-blown disaster, type a 13 in the comments. That was America in 1837, where the press not only reported the panic, it multiplied it. The panic of 1837 was not just a matter of failed banks and falling markets. It was a catastrophe written in human lives, families broken, communities strained, and dreams dissolved into hunger and despair. For the common people, the collapse was not a headline, but a daily struggle to survive. In New York, unemployment swelled so quickly that whole neighborhoods seemed emptied of work. Carpenters who had built fine townhouses now loitered at street corners, their tools pawned for a few coins. Dockworkers, once assured of steady wages, moving barrels and crates. Along the bustling wharves stood idle as ships lay moored and unloaded. Women who had found work as seamstresses or mill hands were dismissed in droves, left to scrape together pennies by mending clothes or selling bread from baskets. Children, barefoot and hollow-eyed, begged for crusts outside bakeries. A city that only months before had glittered with prosperity now seemed haunted by want. Charity. Organizations tried desperately to fill the gap. Churches opened soup kitchens. Reform societies collected donations of bread, flour, and firewood. But the need was overwhelming. Lines for food stretched down blocks, men and women waiting in silence for a ladle of soup. The shame was often as heavy as the hunger. One woman, recorded in a relief worker's journal, whispered that she had never begged in her life until that day. Her husband had been a proud shoemaker, now ruined by bad banknotes. In rural areas, the suffering was quieter but no less real. Farmers who had mortgaged themselves to purchase land during the boom years faced foreclosure when they could not. PE auction notices filled small-town papers, offering farms, livestock, and tools for sale to satisfy debts. Families who had dreamed of prosperity were driven from their homesteads, forced to become tenants or wanderers. In parts of Ohio and Illinois, whole communities seemed to unravel as neighbors departed in search of work elsewhere. The South felt its own sting. Cotton, once a source of near-guaranteed wealth, collapsed in price. Planters who had borrowed heavily found themselves unable to repay British creditors. Enslaved people, treated cruelly as collateral in loans, were sold off in heartbreaking numbers as plantations went bankrupt. The human cost here was doubled. White families ruined financially, and black families torn apart by the auction block. One traveler through Mississippi noted grimly that misery reigns in the mansion as on the quarter. Personal stories captured the anguish. A mechanic in Philadelphia, once prosperous enough to employ 2 apprentices, wrote in a letter, "I have dismissed my boys. My shop is silent. My children cry for bread, and I can offer only promises." In Boston, a widow was reported to have pawned her wedding ring for flour. In frontier Kentucky, a young farmer burned his corn for fuel because no one would buy it. Each tale was different, yet all carried the same refrain. Ruin, desperation sometimes turned to unrest. In New York, crowds rioted against flour merchants accused of hoarding grain. In Baltimore, a bank president was assaulted in the street by angry depositors. Some communities whispered of revolution, though few had the strength to act on such threats. Most endured in silence, waiting for relief that never seemed to come. And yet, amidst the wreckage, there were glimpses of resilience. Neighbors shared what little they had. Churches opened doors to the homeless. Farmers traded goods in kind. When money failed, corn for cloth, firewood for meat. The human instinct to endure, to help one another, flickered even in the darkest days. But no act of charity could erase the broader disaster. The panic of 1837 stripped away illusions. It revealed how fragile prosperity could be, how quickly fortunes could vanish, and how deeply ordinary lives were tied to the abstract currents of finance and policy. For the common man, it was not Jackson's speeches or bankers' ledgers that mattered, but the empty cupboard and the cold hearth. If you've ever seen tough times hit hardest on those least to blame, type A14 in the comments. That was the true tragedy of 1837. The ruin fell heaviest on those who could least endure it. By the close of 1837, America was a nation staggering under the weight of shock. What had begun as a banking panic in New York had spread into every corner of the country, leaving no community untouched. The scale of the disaster bewildered a people who, only a year earlier, had believed themselves living in an age of limitless prosperity. The numbers told a grim story. By some estimates, more than half of the country's banks had either failed outright or suspended payment. Over 600 businesses in New York City alone declared bankruptcy before the year was out. In Philadelphia, factories that once roared with activity stood empty, their windows dark. Across the Midwest, land that had sold for $10 an acre at the height of speculation now fetched barely a fraction of that. Fortunes evaporated with the swiftness of morning dew. Yet statistics, however grim, could not capture the sense of national bewilderment. Americans prided themselves on resilience, on an unshakable belief in progress. The sudden collapse shook that faith. Ministers thundered from pulpits that the panic was a judgment from God against greed. Politicians pointed fingers, each side blaming the other. Ordinary families, caught in the middle, wondered how the dream of prosperity had turned so swiftly to nightmare. The impact reached even the highest levels of government. Martin Van Buren, who had just succeeded Jackson in the White House, found himself presiding over chaos. Almost immediately, he was branded with the cruel nickname Martin Van Ruin. His calm, measured demeanor only fueled the anger of those who demanded bold action. Yet Van Buren clung to Jacksonian principles. The government must not interfere too deeply in the economy. Relief would have to come, he insisted, through patience and discipline, not bailouts or reckless spending. For the suffering masses, such words were cold comfort. Political cartoonists had a field day. One widely circulated print showed Van Buren calmly polishing his boots, while behind him a city collapsed into flames. Another depicted Jackson and Van Buren leading the people into a pit labeled ruin. Humor, bitter as it was, offered some relief. But beneath the laughter lay fury. The Panic of 1837 had become not just an economic disaster, but a political weapon. Internationally, the crisis revealed America's vulnerability. British bankers, wary of American paper promises, demanded repayment in specie. With gold and silver drained, trade faltered. Ships that once carried cotton and grain across the Atlantic now sat idle. The United States, which had bragged of economic independence, discovered that it was bound tightly to the fortunes of Europe. The young republic was not as invincible as it had believed. For ordinary citizens, survival remained the daily challenge. Winter bore down with particular cruelty. Firewood prices rose, and many families shivered in unheated rooms. Bread grew scarce, and riots flared sporadically in urban centers. Letters from the time describe households eating little more than potatoes and broth. Children died of malnutrition in cities that, a year earlier, had boasted of overflowing markets, and yet Americans endured. They patched shoes with scraps, turned old coats inside out for a second season, and leaned on neighbors for support. Communities improvised local barter systems when cash disappeared. Farmers traded wheat for cloth. Millers exchanged flour for firewood, and blacksmiths mended tools in exchange for food. These makeshift arrangements could not replace a functioning economy, but they allowed many to stagger through the worst months. The nation, however, was not quick to recover. The Panic of 1837 did not end in a single year. Its consequences stretched into a long depression that lasted through the mid-1840s. Entire generations remembered the shock, carrying scars of mistrust toward banks and paper money. Parents who had lost everything warned their children never to gamble on credit, never to trust a banknote too freely, and never to assume prosperity was permanent. The crash left a lasting imprint on the American psyche. It demonstrated how fragile prosperity could be, how easily speculation and weak institutions could turn dreams into nightmares. It also exposed a bitter truth. Those who made the reckless decisions were not always the ones who paid the price. Ordinary workers, farmers, and families bore the heaviest burdens. While some speculators and politicians emerged relatively unscathed, by the end of that dark year, the United States was no longer a nation intoxicated with boundless optimism. It was a country sobered by suffering, still standing but deeply shaken. The panic of 1837 had ripped away the illusion of invulnerability and left behind a lesson written in hardship that speculation, unchecked and unrestrained, could undo even the brightest dreams. If you think America in 1837 learned that lesson for good, type A15 in the comments. But history suggests otherwise, because time and again, the fever of speculation returns, and the dominoes are set up all over again. The panic of 1837 may have begun in the counting houses of New York and the vaults of shuttered banks, but its true impact was written on the faces of ordinary Americans. Economic collapse, after all, is not just numbers on a ledger, it is hunger. In a child's eyes, silence in a workshop once filled with hammers, and shame on the face of a man who can no longer provide for his family. In New York City, the once crowded streets told the story. Broadway, which only months before had sparkled with carriages and well-dressed shoppers, now hosted long lines of the unemployed waiting outside relief centers. Men in patched coats stood silently, clutching hats in calloused hands, hoping for a loaf of bread or a bowl of thin soup. Children gathered near bakeries, pressing their noses against the glass, staring at loaves they could not buy. The sound of commerce, the calls of vendors, the chatter of customers was replaced by the shuffle of desperate feet. Relief efforts sprang up quickly, but could never keep pace. Churches opened, soup kitchens that ladled out watery stew to hundreds. Each day, civic groups collected firewood to distribute during the brutal winter of 1837 to 38. But the demand was endless. The New York Commercial Advertiser reported that one relief station ran out of bread within an hour of opening its doors, leaving hundreds still in line. The reporter wrote grimly, "We have seen men, once merchants, reduced to begging crumbs." Alongside paupers, the collapse cut across class lines. Respectable artisans who had built comfortable lives found themselves suddenly ruined. A cabinet maker in Brooklyn, who once employed 3 apprentices, now pawned his tools to feed his family. A seamstress who had earned steady wages making dresses for wealthy households was dismissed when her employers tightened their belts. Respectability, carefully built over decades, vanished overnight. Families that had prided themselves on independence now relied on charity, their shame as deep as their hunger. In Philadelphia, a Quaker relief worker described visiting a family where the father, once a printer, had been out of work for months. The children huddled in rags near a cold fireplace. The mother admitted they had not eaten meat in weeks. "We are reduced," she whispered, "to bread and hope." Across the country, such stories multiplied until they became the common refrain of the age. The suffering was not confined to cities. In rural communities, foreclosures forced families from farms. Auction posters nailed to fence posts announced the sale of acres, livestock, and tools to satisfy debts. Neighbors gathered to watch, some weeping, as a lifetime's labor was sold off for pennies. Many displaced families joined the swelling tide of migrants drifting toward cities, seeking work that rarely existed. The countryside, once imagined as a refuge of stability, became another theater of despair. The human cost also showed in health. Malnutrition spread as families cut meals to the bare minimum. Bread, once the staple of working households, doubled in price. Potatoes and corn became the daily fare, with little meat or fresh produce. Diseases that thrived on hunger, dysentery, fevers, respiratory illness, took a heavier toll. Poor families, crammed into crowded tenements or shacks, were hit hardest. In New York's Five Points district, already infamous for poverty, death rates climbed alarmingly. What made the suffering more bitter was the contrast. Even as thousands went hungry, some wealthy speculators and bankers weathered the storm, retreating to comfortable homes and estates. To the poor, It seemed as though the burdens of ruin had fallen on those least able to endure them. Resentment simmered. In some cities, crowds attacked flour warehouses or protested outside wealthy merchants' homes. Though these eruptions were rare, they revealed a growing sense that the system itself was unjust. The Panic of 1837 stripped away illusions. For years, Americans had believed in endless opportunity, that hard work and ambition guaranteed success. Now, many who had worked hard and lived prudently found themselves ruined by forces they could neither control nor fully understand. The sense of betrayal was palpable. "We have been deceived," wrote one anonymous letter to a New York paper. "Our labor has been wasted, our savings stolen, our hopes mocked." If you've ever watched hardworking people suffer while others skate through unscathed, type A16 in the comments. That was the bitter reality for thousands of Americans facing empty streets, empty workshops, and empty stomachs in the winter of 1837. If hunger and unemployment were the most visible scars of the Panic of 1837, then broken promises were the deepest wounds. Across America, families who had trusted banks, employers, and even the government found those assurances collapsing into dust. Ruin was not only material, but also moral, as trust itself became a casualty. Take the story of the soldiers who had served in the Seminole Wars in Florida. Many returned home expecting wages or land payments, only to be handed paper notes that quickly depreciated. A veteran who thought he had earned enough to buy a farm discovered his pay was worth half as much by the time he reached home. Some never saw any compensation at all. Letters poured into Congress from angry veterans and their widows, pleading for relief. Few received answers. The government, just as strapped for specie as the banks, offered little more than sympathy. Farmers bore similar betrayals. During the boom years, they had borrowed heavily to expand buying new plows, livestock, and acres of western soil. Banks had courted them with easy loans, promising that prosperity was certain. Now, those same banks called in debts with ruthless efficiency. Foreclosure notices piled up. Sheriff sales became grim public spectacles, where neighbors watched. Household goods and family heirlooms auctioned off for pennies. Children saw their parents' dignity dismantled piece by piece. For many, the humiliation lingered longer than the poverty itself. Urban workers also learned the fragility of promises. Factories and workshops had expanded rapidly during the boom, luring men and women with the assurance of steady wages. But when credit dried up, employers dismissed workers without hesitation. There were no contracts, no severance, no safety nets. Families that had planned futures on dependable income were cast adrift overnight. One laborer in New York wrote bitterly to a local paper, "Our masters told us we were needed. Now they tell us we are nothing. Are we less human because the banks have failed?" Women, often doubly vulnerable, carried much of the burden. Many had supplemented family income by taking in sewing or laundry. When households could no longer afford even these services, their earnings evaporated. Widows with children were especially hard hit, often reduced to begging. Newspapers reported cases of mothers leaving infants at church doors with desperate notes, asking strangers to provide what they could not. The panic was ruthless in exposing society's thin support for its most vulnerable. Promises failed not only at the personal level, but at the civic one. State governments, eager to fund ambitious projects during the boom, had issued bonds and borrowed heavily. When revenues collapsed, they defaulted. Citizens who had invested savings in supposedly safe state bonds found themselves ruined. Trust in government, already shaken by Jackson's war on the bank, now seemed almost naive. If even the states could not honor debts, who or what was left to believe in? The emotional toll of these broken promises cannot be overstated. Pride was a central value in the young republic. Americans prided themselves on self-reliance. on the ability to stand tall as free citizens. To be cast into poverty by forces beyond one's control felt like betrayal not only by banks and politicians, but by the very dream of America itself. Letters, diaries, and sermons of the time reveal a nation questioning its own soul. And yet, through the bitterness, there were also small acts of endurance. Families clung together, stretching what little they had. Communities sometimes rallied to support neighbors at foreclosure auctions, bidding deliberately low so families could buy back essential goods. A few employers, though rare, kept on workers at reduced wages rather than dismiss them entirely. These gestures could not undo the ruin, but offered glimmers of solidarity. Still, the dominant note of the period was despair. The Panic of 1837 did not just break banks, it broke faith. Promises that had once bound society between government and citizens, employers and workers, banks and borrowers, lay shattered. The people of the United States entered the late 1830s poorer in coin, poorer in goods, and poorer in trust. If you've ever been let down by a promise that mattered, whether from a friend, a boss, or an institution, type a 17 in the comments. That bitter taste of betrayal was the daily reality for thousands of Americans during the long unraveling of 1837. Economic collapse rarely remains confined to ledgers and bank vaults. It spills into the streets, where frustration becomes fury. In the wake of the Panic of 1837, that fury erupted across American cities. Hunger, unemployment, and broken promises hardened into anger, and anger soon sought targets: bankers, merchants, politicians, anyone who seemed to have escaped the ruin. The most notorious eruption came in New York in February 1837, months before the full banking collapse. Prices for flour had soared, doubling in a matter of weeks. Families who already spent most of their income on bread now faced starvation. Rumors spread that merchants were hoarding grain to drive up prices. One evening, a crowd of thousands gathered at City Hall Park, demanding relief. What began as speeches and chanting soon turned violent. Mobs marched through the streets, smashing the windows of flour warehouses, seizing barrels, and rolling them into the gutters. Police struggled to contain the chaos as rioters stormed stores, crying out that they had been robbed by greed. Newspapers dubbed it the Flour Riot. Though order was restored, the anger lingered. Philadelphia saw similar unrest, when banks suspended payments and unemployment soared. Mobs surrounded financial institutions, pelting them with stones. Some crowds threatened to drag bankers into the streets. Authorities responded with militia patrols, but the tension was palpable. In Baltimore, angry workers burned effigies of Van Buren, branding him Van Ruin, and blaming him for their misery. The sense of betrayal was not confined to partisan lines, it was visceral, rooted in empty stomachs and shuttered shops. Beyond, urban riots, smaller acts of resistance dotted the countryside. In Ohio and Kentucky, farmers formed anti-rent associations, vowing to resist foreclosures. When sheriffs arrived to auction seized property, neighbors sometimes gathered to disrupt the sales. In some cases, crowds intimidated bidders or even destroyed auctioneer stands. Such defiance rarely succeeded in the long run, but it reflected a growing belief that the system itself was stacked against ordinary people. The violence unsettled the nation's elites. Newspapers sympathetic to business warned of mob rule and compared the unrest to the upheavals then shaking Europe. Politicians fretted that the republic itself might be endangered if order collapsed. But for the poor and unemployed, riot was less ideology than desperation. When bread costs more than wages, smashing a flour barrel feels like justice. Not all protests turned violent. Workers also organized peacefully, giving birth to early labor movements. In 1837 and 1838, unemployed associations formed in several cities, demanding public works to provide jobs. They petitioned legislatures, marched in orderly processions, and published pamphlets arguing that a democratic government owed its citizens more than indifference. Though these movements achieved little immediate success, they planted seeds for the labor activism that would grow later in the century. Religious leaders also weighed in, seeking to channel anger into moral reform. Sermons thundered against greed and intemperance, urging Americans to repent, not only of speculation, but of sin. Some revivalists declared that the panic was divine punishment, a chastisement meant to humble a prideful nation. Their fiery words drew large crowds, offering spiritual explanations when economic ones proved too complex. Yet for the starving, salvation did little to fill the stomach. The unrest revealed a deeper fracture in American society, the widening gulf between rich and poor. In New York, while mobs rioted for bread, wealthy families still dined in elegant parlors. The contrast was galling. Satirical cartoons mocked the divide, portraying fat bankers feasting while ragged workers begged outside their windows. For many, the panic confirmed what they had long suspected, that prosperity was not shared equally, and that those at the top could insulate themselves from ruin, while those at the bottom bore the brunt. Despite the anger, most Americans did not embrace revolution. Unlike in France, where economic crisis had toppled monarchs, the United States clung to its democratic institutions. But the discontent of 1837 to 38 left scars. It fueled distrust of banks, hardened class resentments, and inspired a generation of reformers who sought to address the inequality laid bare by the panic. If you've ever felt that anger boils quickest when people see abundance on one side of the street and starvation on the other, type A18 in the comments. That was the rage of 1837. Riots of flour, mobs in the streets, and a restless people demanding justice in the face of hunger. The Panic of 1837 did not simply create a line between the wealthy and the destitute. It squeezed and distorted the space in between. What we might call the middle class of the young republic artisans, shopkeepers, small merchants, and independent professionals found themselves especially vulnerable. They lacked the insulation of great wealth, yet had more to lose than the laborer who owned nothing but his hands. In the collapse, many of them slid downward, their pride and livelihoods eroded. Consider the artisans of New England. For decades, they had prided themselves on skill, independence, and steady income. A shoemaker might employ a few apprentices. A cabinet maker might run a modest workshop. A tailor might maintain a loyal clientele. These trades were not glamorous, but they sustained families and offered respectability. The panic swept it all away. Customers vanished, unable to pay for new shoes or furniture. Credit that once kept workshops afloat disappeared as banks refused loans. Apprentices were dismissed, shops were shuttered, and proud craftsmen took to hawking their tools in pawn shops. Small merchants fared no better. The grocer, who had extended credit to neighbors, now faced unpaid bills. The general store owner, who had stocked goods on the promise of future payment, was ruined when suppliers demanded cash he did not have. Bankruptcy rolls swelled with names, once regarded as pillars of their communities. Bankruptcy was not merely financial failure, it carried deep social stigma. Families who had walked tall on Main Street now avoided neighbors' eyes. Teachers, clerks, and minor professionals also suffered. Salaries were slashed or withheld. Schools closed when local governments ran out of funds. Clerks were dismissed as businesses shrank. The very fabric of respectable, educated society frayed. For many, the fall into poverty was swift and humiliating. Diaries from the period speak of families forced to sell heirlooms, move into smaller lodgings, or take in boarders to scrape together rent. The collapse of this fragile middle carried broader consequences. These were the people who had fueled America's optimism in the 1820s and early 1830s. They were the buyers of books, the patrons of theaters, the subscribers to newspapers. Their aspirations had defined the promise of upward mobility. Now, stripped of means, they lost not only material comfort but also cultural confidence. A nation that prided itself on opportunity now wrestled with doubt. Was prosperity truly within reach, or was it an illusion reserved for the few? The psychological toll was immense. Respectability was the lifeblood of the middle class, and to lose it was devastating. Men who had defined themselves as providers faced shame when they could no longer support families. Women who had run respectable households struggled with the indignity of relying on charity. Children, once destined for apprenticeships or schooling, were thrust into labor to help make ends meet. Pride, more than hunger, carved the deepest wounds at the same time. Some wealthier Americans seized opportunity from the wreckage. With land prices collapsing, those who still had coin or foreign credit snapped up acres at bargain rates. Small merchants, forced to sell shops and inventories at auction, watched as richer competitors expanded empires. In this way, the panic accelerated inequality. The strong grew stronger, while the fragile middle disappeared into the ranks of the poor. One telling example came from upstate New York, where a modest mill owner named Samuel Bartlett had built a comfortable life producing flour for local markets. When the panic struck, creditors demanded payment in specie. Bartlett could not deliver. His mill was sold at auction for a fraction of its worth, purchased by a wealthier neighbor who had hoarded coin. Bartlett, once a man of standing, became a hired hand in the very mill he had built. His story, repeated in countless variations, symbolized the vanishing middle. Newspapers of the era, sympathetic to their middle-class readership, lamented this destruction. Editorials warned that democracy itself was endangered if independent tradesmen and shopkeepers vanished, leaving only a gulf between wealthy elites and impoverished masses. "The Republic cannot endure," wrote one Boston paper, "when its sturdy middle is destroyed." These warnings would echo through future crises, a recurring reminder of the importance and fragility of that class. The Panic of 1837 thus reshaped the American social landscape. It did not topple the rich, who often weathered the storm, nor did it invent poverty, which had always existed. Instead, it hollowed out the middle, erasing the buffer that had offered hope of mobility and stability. The promise that hard work and thrift alone could secure prosperity rang hollow. For many Americans, the panic proved that forces far beyond their control policies in Washington, banks in New York, creditors in London could dictate their fate. If you've ever seen people who did everything right still lose everything, type A19 in the comments. That was the cruel reality for America's vanishing middle in 1837. Respectability lost, dreams dismantled, and a society left more divided than before. By 1839, 2 years after the first shock of the panic, Americans were learning that the wounds of 1837 would not close quickly. What many had hoped would be a temporary storm revealed itself as a grinding depression that lingered through the early 1840s. The damage was not only measured in shuttered banks and lost farms, but in the long-term scars etched into the lives of ordinary people. For workers, the depression meant years of insecurity. Employment returned only slowly, and wages, when available, were often half of what they had been before the crash. Strikes broke out in New York and Philadelphia as laborers demanded bread wages, just enough to keep their families alive. Employers themselves, strapped for cash, responded harshly, firing strikers or replacing them with desperate newcomers. The fragile beginnings of the American labor movement were born in this crucible of suffering. Families that had fallen from modest comfort into poverty often never fully recovered. A shopkeeper who had declared bankruptcy might find credit barred, to him for life. A farmer who had lost land to foreclosure might spend the rest of his days as a tenant, watching another man reap profit from fields he once owned. Respectability, once lost, was rarely regained. Children who left school to labor in mills or workshops seldom returned, their futures reshaped permanently by the crisis. Migration patterns also shifted. Thousands abandoned farms and villages to seek work in growing cities, swelling urban populations. Some pushed westward, lured by dreams of starting over on the frontier, only to find that credit was still scarce and opportunities limited. The nation's restless movement across its vast territory was in part fueled by the dislocations of the panic. People uprooted by economic ruin searched for new beginnings, carrying both hope and bitterness with them. The panic also left political scars. Trust in government eroded as Van Buren's administration seemed powerless or unwilling to intervene. His insistence on limited government and adherence to Jacksonian hard money principles made sense to fiscal conservatives, but offered little comfort to the starving. Whig politicians capitalized on this discontent, painting Democrats as indifferent to suffering. The crisis thus reshaped American politics, contributing to the Whig victory in 1840 with William Henry. Harrison's log cabin and hard cider campaign, breadlines and bankruptcies had become campaign issues, proof that economics and politics were inseparable. Religious and cultural life bore marks of the crisis as well. Revivals swelled in the late 1830s, preachers declaring that the panic was divine punishment for greed, pride, and materialism. Camp meetings drew thousands, their fiery sermons offering hope of spiritual renewal, if not material relief. Many Americans, stripped of wealth, turned to faith as the only solid ground left. Others turned cynical, mocking both politicians and preachers for offering promises, while bellies remained empty. Perhaps the deepest scar was psychological. Americans had entered the 1830s buoyed by optimism, convinced that theirs was a nation of limitless opportunity. The panic shattered that confidence. A generation grew up with a wary eye toward banks, speculation, and paper money. Even decades later, elderly survivors of the crisis told grandchildren tales of ruin, warning them never to trust easy prosperity. The trauma lingered in collective memory, shaping attitudes toward risk for years to come. The irony, of course, was that speculation would return. By the 1850s, new booms and busts would sweep across the land, but in 1837, the pain was fresh, and the lesson felt searing. That prosperity built on paper, promises, and reckless speculation could crumble overnight, and that the weakest shoulders bore the heaviest weight. The Panic of 1837 was not the deadliest disaster in American history, nor the most violent, but it was, in many ways, one of the most formative. It revealed the fragility of the Republic's economy, the vulnerability of its people, and the limits of its leaders. Above all, it showed that economic collapse is never abstracted, is measured in hunger, humiliation, and lives diverted from the paths they once imagined. If you believe scars from hard times never fully fade, type A20 in the comments. The people of 1837 would have nodded in agreement, for they carried those scars long after the panic itself had passed. When the banks first closed their doors in May 1837, many Americans believed the crisis would be short-lived. Surely the economy, so vibrant only months before, would right itself within a season. But as the months dragged on, and the years unfolded, it became painfully clear that the panic was not a storm to be weathered. It was the beginning of a long depression that would grind down the nation's confidence well into the 1840s. The first sign that recovery would not come quickly was the persistence of unemployment. By the winter of 1837 to 38, thousands of workers in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston still wandered the streets in search of jobs that did not exist. Relief kitchens continued to feed long lines, Charitable groups wrote in despair that their coffers were empty, while the hungry kept multiplying. Wages for those lucky enough to find work were slashed in half. Carpenters took jobs as dockhands, teachers as clerks, all for meager pay. Families adjusted to survival rather than prosperity. The banking system, once the engine of expansion, remained crippled. Suspensions of specie payment continued off and on for years. Bank failures spread like rot, undermining whatever confidence remained. Farmers who had tucked away notes from local banks sometimes discovered they had been rendered worthless overnight. Merchants refused paper from distant states, demanding only hard money. The dream of a uniform, reliable currency seemed farther away than ever. International pressures compounded the misery. Britain, itself facing financial strain, tightened credit further. British investors, who had once eagerly poured money into American canals, railroads, and state bonds, now recoiled. Capital dried up, leaving half-finished projects to rust and rot. In Pennsylvania, the state's Grand Canal system, once envisioned as a rival to New York's Erie Canal, fell into disrepair as funds evaporated. Across the country, half-built bridges and rail lines stood as monuments to ambition, strangled by depression. Land prices, too, continued their slide. Those who had bought acres at inflated prices during the boom saw values collapse. In Illinois, land that had once fetched $12 an acre could not find a buyer at $2. Desperate sellers offered farms for less than the cost of the fences around them. Many simply abandoned their claims, heading west in search of some fresh start, leaving behind ghostly traces of failed dreams. Politically, the Depression was devastating. For Martin Van Buren, derided as Van Ruin, he faced hostility wherever he turned. His proposed solution, the creation of an independent treasury to separate government funds from private banks, was mocked as too little, too late. The Whigs, sensing opportunity, hammered Democrats for the suffering of ordinary people. By 1840, the public's frustration erupted at the ballot box, sweeping the Whigs to victory with William Henry Harrison's raucous log cabin and hard cider campaign. The Depression had not only wrecked livelihoods, it had realigned political power. Yet beneath the political battles, the deeper wound was cultural. Americans had believed in boundless opportunity, in the certainty that hard work and thrift would be rewarded. The Depression shattered that faith. Diaries and letters reveal a profound disillusionment. I was taught that industry was the sure road to independence, wrote one ruined shopkeeper in 1839. But I see now that fortune favors not labor, but luck. A farmer in Indiana put it more bluntly. We are slaves to paper and coin, and we have no master we can trust. The long shadow of 1837 darkened not only the present, but the nation's future. Young people who came of age during the Depression carried its lessons for life. Suspicious of banks, wary of speculation, skeptical of politicians' promises, they formed a generation marked by caution. Some historians have argued that this lingering wariness helped shape the pragmatic, survivalist spirit that defined mid-19th century America. And yet, even in the depths of despair, Americans adapted. They bartered when money failed, built local credit networks when banks collapsed, and leaned on community when government offered little. These improvised solutions did not end the Depression, but they kept the nation alive through it, in the rubble of ruined banks and abandoned farms. Resilience flickered. If you've ever lived through hard times that seemed to stretch endlessly, type A21 in the comments. That was America's reality after 1837. Crises whose shadow stretched far longer than anyone had feared. When Martin Van Buren took the presidential oath in March 1837, he inherited more than Andrew Jackson's mantle. He inherited a financial system on the brink of collapse. Within 2 months, the crisis erupted, and suddenly, the polished, careful statesman found himself presiding over ruins. To a public Already suspicious of politicians, Van Buren appeared less a leader than an unlucky figurehead caught in a storm not of his making. Yet, as the years of depression dragged on, Van Ruin, as critics gleefully branded him, came to embody the suffering of the age. Van Buren was no Andrew Jackson. Where Old Hickory was fiery and combative, Van Buren was measured, cautious, and deliberate. He believed deeply in limited government and fiscal discipline. In calmer times, those qualities might have been virtues. In the chaos of the late 1830s, they looked like paralysis. People wanted bold relief, jobs, aid, intervention. Instead, Van Buren offered restraint. The government cannot relieve individual distress, he declared, but it can and must avoid aggravating it. To starving families, those words sounded cold. His signature proposal was the independent treasury system, introduced in 1837 and debated for years before adoption. The plan was simple in theory: remove federal funds from the volatile pet banks and store them in government vaults. By divorcing the government's money from private institutions, Van Buren hoped to restore integrity and reduce speculation. Critics, however, argued it would only further tighten credit, hoarding specie instead of circulating it, in the eyes of merchants and workers desperate for relief. The independent treasury was too abstract, too slow, and too irrelevant to daily hunger. Meanwhile, the suffering deepened. In New York, unemployment lingered above 20%. Soup kitchens, once temporary measures, became semi-permanent fixtures. Farmers continued to lose land, and states such as Mississippi and Michigan defaulted on bonds, further undermining confidence. The Depression was not merely economic, it was cultural. Satirical songs mocked Van Buren's polished manners, portraying him as a pampered aristocrat who sipped fine wine while common folks starved. One broadsheet jeered, "Van Ruin smiles in silk, while the people cry in rags." Whig politicians seized the opportunity with gusto. Henry Clay denounced the administration as timid in action, reckless in philosophy. Newspapers loyal to the Whigs filled their pages with biting cartoons, Van Buren clutching gold while children begged for bread, or lounging in luxury as factories closed. The Whigs framed the Depression as proof of democratic incompetence. By 1839, as the crisis dragged into its third year, the political tide had turned decisively against the Democrats. And yet, to blame Van Buren entirely was unfair. Many of the roots of the crisis lay in Jackson's war on the bank, in the speculative fever of the early 1830s, and in international pressures beyond any president's control. But politics rarely rewards nuance. The man in office when disaster strikes bears the burden, and Van Buren bore it heavily. His calm speeches about discipline and patience sounded like lectures to a people who wanted bread, not philosophy. For Van Buren personally, the Depression was devastating. Once hailed as Jackson's heir, he became instead a national scapegoat. The election of 1840 turned into a referendum on his leadership, or lack thereof. The Whigs staged a masterful campaign, portraying their candidate, William Henry Harrison, as a humble log cabin hero of the people, while Van Buren was mocked as out of touch. In a time of ruin, image mattered more than policy, and Van Buren's image was fatal. Yet his legacy deserves a second glance. The independent treasury, though ridiculed at the time, eventually became a cornerstone of federal finance, outlasting the panic and shaping government practice for decades. His adherence to discipline, while politically disastrous, reflected a belief that reckless government aid could deepen instability. In hindsight, Van Buren was not blind, but caught between principle and desperation, between the ideals of limited government and the reality of mass suffering. Still, for ordinary Americans, those nuances were meaningless. What they saw was hunger, unemployment, and a president who seemed aloof. "We call him Van Ruin, for he has ruined us," one worker told a reporter in 1839. That nickname stuck, as enduring as the Depression itself. If you've ever seen someone inherit a mess and take the blame for it, type A22 in the comments. That was Martin van Buren's fate. He bore the burden of a panic he had not caused, but could not control. The Panic of 1837 did not merely devastate individuals and families, it brought entire states to their knees. For the first time in American history, state governments defaulted on their debts, shaking confidence not only at home but across the Atlantic. The collapse was not just a domestic affair, it was a global shock, revealing how interconnected the young republic had already become. During the boom years, states had borrowed heavily to fund ambitious projects. Canals, railroads, and public buildings seemed essential to match the nation's rapid growth. Legislators promised that tolls and trade would more than repay the debts. British and Dutch investors, hungry for returns, eagerly bought American bonds. London's financial markets buzzed with confidence in the United States, a land of vast resources and boundless promise. Then came the crash. As revenues collapsed, states found themselves unable to meet payments. Mississippi defaulted in 1839, refusing to honor millions in bonds. Michigan followed, then Arkansas, Louisiana, and others. By the early 1840s, 8 states in the territory of Florida had suspended payment on debts. The default sent shockwaves across Europe. Investors, who had once praised American vigor, now spoke of American dishonor. British newspapers sneered that the land of liberty was rich in excuses but poor in principle. The impact at home was severe. Creditors demanded specie, but states had none. Taxes could not fill the gap, as citizens already reeled from depression. Legislatures debated solutions with desperation. Some proposed raising taxes sharply, provoking outrage from struggling farmers. Others suggested repudiations, simply refusing to pay, branding the debts illegitimate. Mississippi famously declared its bonds fraudulent and refused repayment altogether, a decision that stained its reputation for generations. Communities felt the consequences. Canal projects in Pennsylvania halted midstream, leaving half-ditches littering the countryside. In Illinois, ambitious railroad schemes collapsed, their tracks rusting in the fields. Workers hired to build these marvels of progress were dismissed en masse, swelling the ranks of the unemployed. The grand promise of infrastructure-driven prosperity turned into a graveyard of abandoned projects. The defaults also deepened class resentment. Wealthy bondholders, many based in eastern cities, demanded repayment, while poor farmers balked at higher taxes to satisfy distant financiers. Political debates grew heated. Whig leaders argued that honoring debts was essential to preserve credit and national honor. Democrats countered that it was unjust to squeeze blood from a starving populace. The conflict revealed a tension that would haunt America for decades. How to balance fiscal responsibility with popular suffering. Internationally, the damage lingered. British investors, once eager to fund American growth, grew wary. Capital flowed more cautiously, raising borrowing costs for years. The United States discovered that its reputation abroad mattered as much as its policies at home. To many Europeans, the defaulting states confirmed old suspicions that democracy bred irresponsibility. For Americans, the criticism stung, but there was little they could do except slowly rebuild trust. Ordinary citizens, of course, lived the consequences in the most direct way. A farmer in Arkansas, whose taxes suddenly doubled to service state debt, wrote bitterly that he was paying for promises made by men in offices I shall never see. In Pennsylvania, unemployed canal workers cursed both the state and the bankers, saying they had been duped into digging ditches of despair. The sense of betrayal deepened the wounds of the Depression. Yet the defaults also forced a hard reckoning. States learned, painfully, that ambition without discipline carried ruinous costs. In later decades, many states adopted constitutional limits on debt, requiring balanced budgets or voter approval for borrowing. These measures, born in the ashes of 1837, shaped American fiscal policy for generations. The defaults were not merely financial, they were symbolic. They marked the moment when America's boundless optimism collided with reality, when the Republic's soaring ambitions met the hard ground of obligation. The dream of perpetual growth was exposed as a myth, and the lesson, though bitter, was unforgettable. If you've ever seen a grand project collapse because the money ran out, type A23 in the comments. That was America in the early 1840s, a world of defaults. Half-finished canals, broken promises, and lessons written in debt. If the Panic of 1837 left America poorer in coin, it left the nation richer in lessons, though whether those lessons were remembered is another story. At its heart, the crisis was a parable about speculation, how dreams of quick wealth can inflate beyond reason, how institutions can encourage the madness, and how ordinary people are left to pay the price. When it all comes crashing down, the land boom of the early 1830s was the clearest example. Millions of acres had been bought and sold, often by men who never set foot on the soil. Deeds passed through hands like gambling chips, each buyer convinced he could sell to another at a higher price. The frenzy seemed unstoppable until Jackson's specie circular demanded payment in hard money, pulling the rug from beneath the gamblers. When the music stopped, families who had mortgaged everything to join the game found themselves ruined. It was a lesson in how bubbles burst, but one Americans would repeat in railroads, stocks, housing, and even digital currencies nearly 2 centuries later. The banking system offered another harsh lesson. Without strong oversight, hundreds of local banks printed notes far beyond their reserves, creating an illusion of prosperity. For a while, it worked until confidence cracked. Once depositors demanded specie, the whole structure collapsed. The cycle revealed a truth that remains relevant. Money is as much about trust as about metal or paper. Destroy that trust, and even the wealthiest nation can find itself paralyzed. Farmers, merchants, and workers also learned that promises of prosperity are fragile. During the boom, banks and politicians alike told them that credit was the key to opportunity. Many believed, borrowing heavily to buy land or expand businesses. When the panic came, they discovered that debt was not a ladder, but a trap. Generations later, Americans would recall the 1830s as a cautionary tale against overextension. As one ruined farmer put it in 1839, "I reached for more acres than I could plow, and now I have not even the field I began with." Politically, the panic taught the danger of absolutism. Jackson's war on the Bank of the United States was driven by principle, his hatred of concentrated power and paper money. Yet in destroying one flawed institution, he unleashed chaos across dozens of weaker ones. The lesson was sobering. Sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. Strong institutions, however imperfect, can provide stability that prevents disaster. But in the heat of ideology, that truth was ignored. The Depression also reminded Americans of their entanglement with the wider world. British creditors, demanding repayment in specie, helped trigger the collapse. America, for all its vast land and resources, could not stand apart from global markets. The lesson that national prosperity depends on international trust was bitterly learned in the 1840s and remains true today. For the common people, the deepest lesson was that speculation always punishes the innocent. Bankers and big speculators often found ways to escape, selling assets before the collapse or retreating into wealth. It was the worker who lost his job, the widow who lost her savings, the farmer who lost his land. This asymmetry bred resentment and fueled calls for reform. Many Americans emerged from the panic, convinced that unchecked capitalism carried dangers as grave as government tyranny. Yet, as history shows, lessons fade. By the 1850s, new booms swept across the land, fueled by railroads and Western expansion. By the 1920s, speculation on stocks echoed the same patterns as the 1830s. By the 2000s, housing and financial derivatives repeated the cycle once again. The Panic of 1837 stands as an early chapter in a story that repeats endlessly: optimism, speculation, collapse, and regret. If you believe that every generation must relearn the dangers of reckless speculation, type A24 in the comments. The people of 1837 would have warned us, but history suggests we rarely listen for long. By the early 1840s, the worst of the Panic of 1837 had passed, but the depression it unleashed lingered. The nation staggered forward, scarred and chastened, yet still determined to believe in its future. The shock had been profound, shattering fortunes, breaking families, and leaving scars that endured for decades. But it also left behind echoes that would resonate through every subsequent crisis in American history. One echo was distrust of banks. For years after the panic, many Americans preferred to hoard gold and silver rather than deposit it. Banks were accepted warily, scrutinized, and often discounted. The image of worthless paper haunted the imagination. Farmers told children never to trust a promise that could not be weighed in coin. The distrust helped fuel later populist movements that railed against moneyed interests and demanded reforms to protect ordinary people. Another echo was political. The downfall of Van Buren and the triumph of the Whigs in 1840 showed how deeply economic suffering could reshape power. Campaigns would never again ignore the kitchen table. Prosperity and panic, bread and hunger, jobs and unemployment. These became central themes of American politics. Every candidate afterward would be judged not only on character, but on whether he could safeguard the economy from ruin. The cultural echoes were subtler, but just as enduring. The Panic of 1837 tempered the optimism of a young nation. Americans still dreamed boldly, still pushed westward, still built cities and railroads, but with a lingering shadow of caution. Even decades later, elderly survivors recalled the panic with a shudder. We were rich one day and beggars the next. One man told his grandson in 1870, "Never trust a boom boy, for it always ends in bust." These memories shaped a national character, both ambitious and wary, forever torn between daring speculation and prudent restraint. The panic also foreshadowed future crises. The chain of events, the fever of speculation, reckless lending, collapse of confidence, and a grinding depression would repeat in 1857, in 1873, in 1929, and beyond. Each time, Americans told themselves the lesson had been learned. Each time, the cycle returned. The Panic of 1837 was thus not only a tragedy of its own era, but a template for the fragility of prosperity in a capitalist democracy. For historians, the panic offers a window into the costs of progress. America in the 1830s was expanding, innovating, and striving, but it was also reckless, unequal, and vulnerable. The panic revealed the human cost of speculation, the dangers of weak institutions, and the limits of political leadership. Above all, it showed that the price of ambition is often paid not by the dreamers, but by the laborers, the widows, and the children left hungry when dreams collapse. And yet, America endured. The Republic did not dissolve. Its people adapted, rebuilt, and pushed forward. Out of the ashes of the panic came new movements, labor unions, calls for banking reform, and demands for more accountable government. The scars hurt, but they also shaped resilience. The people who had walked through breadlines and endured foreclosure would later face even greater challenges: the Civil War, Reconstruction, industrial upheaval, and they carried with them the hard lessons of 1837. Looking back, the Panic of 1837 feels both distant and familiar. The fashions, the carriages, the quills and ledgers belong to another age. But the story, the rush of speculation, the collapse of trust, the suffering of ordinary people, could be told of almost any century. It is the story of human ambition colliding with human folly. If you've stayed with me all the way through this long, sleepless journey into America's first great financial disaster, type A25 in the comments. And if you've nodded off and just woke up, drop a 25 anyway. I'll still count it, because history is not just about the past, it's about the patterns that repeat, the warnings we ignore, and the lessons we never quite seem to learn. We've traveled a long way together, from the booming streets of the 1830s, filled with paper money and land fever, to the shuttered banks and empty cupboards of the Panic of 1837, and through the long shadow it cast across the next decade. It has been a story of ambition and arrogance, of ordinary people chasing dreams and paying the price when those dreams collapsed. And if you've made it this far, you already know. History does not repeat exactly, but it certainly rhymes in verses all too familiar. The Panic of 1837 was, in many ways, America's first great encounter with the perils of modern capitalism. It wasn't just a banking collapse or a currency crisis. It was a reminder that prosperity is fragile, that trust can vanish overnight, and that the gap between rich and poor always widens fastest when the floor gives way. A shoemaker who lost his savings, a widow whose notes turned worthless, a farmer whose land was auctioned. These lives mattered as much as the presidents and bankers whose names filled the headlines. Andrew Jackson believed he had slain a monster in destroying the Bank of the United States. Instead, he unleashed a swarm of smaller monsters, pet banks, speculation, and reckless credit that devoured the nation's confidence. Martin Van Buren, inheriting the wreckage, became the unlucky face of ruin. He carried the burden of policies, not entirely his own, but history is rarely merciful to the man in office when disaster strikes. What strikes me most, though, is how eerily the story feels like déjà vu. Substitute land speculation with dot-com stocks, railroad bonds, housing mortgages, or even cryptocurrency, and you'll see the same cycle: optimism, frenzy, collapse, despair. Human nature hasn't changed. We still dream of quick riches, we still trust in paper promises, and we still believe against all evidence that the boom will last forever. And when it doesn't, it is always the ordinary family that pays first and pays hardest. The lesson of 1837, then, is not merely about banks and coins, it is about humility. No economy is invincible, no generation immune to folly. The United States, so young and confident in the 1830s, learned that lesson the hard way. And yet, even in ruin, Americans endured. They bartered when money failed, built communities when governments faltered, and carried forward a resilience that would serve them in crises to come. As we close this long, sleepless journey, I'd like to ask you, what lessons of 1837 still resonate today? Do you see echoes in our own time, in housing markets, in financial speculation, in the fragile trust we place in institutions? Share your thoughts below. Comment 26 if you believe history's warnings are still with us, and maybe comment 27 if you think we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes again and again. And of course, if you've stayed awake through the booms, the busts, the riots, and the long depression, give this video a like. If you enjoy wandering through the ruins of history with me, where the past whispers truths about our present, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey, and leave a comment. Whether it's a thoughtful reflection or just a sleepy hello, because even in the quiet of the night, I'm here to read them. History may keep us awake, but perhaps that's a good thing. Better to lose a little sleep than to lose our memory. Better to remember 1837 than to stumble blindly into its echo. So until next time, rest well, dream wisely, and never forget. Speculation is easy, survival is hard, and lessons if we choose to listen are timeless.